all our housekeeping out of the way, I want to begin by thanking all of you for taking time out of your day to join this webinar as we discuss cleaner fuels for a cleaner future. This webinar will focus on policies tied to low carbon fuels and how these policies benefit consumers and the environment. My name is Dr. Quinta Warren, and I will be moderating the panel discussion today. I am the Associate Director of Sustainability Policy at Consumer Reports. Behind the scenes, we are joined by Calvin Jackson. We also have Alan Smith, both of them from our community development team here at Consumer Reports. We're also joined by Alexandra Gross and Sierra Wilbar from the Sustainability Policy team. And we are finally joined by Meg Bone from our mobilization team. Well, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Deland Jaff, who is a policy analyst for sustainability policy at Consumer Reports. We also have Dr. Jeremy Martin, who is the Director of Fuels Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we have Rich Cassell, who is a partner at AJW. But I'll now pivot to the panelists and ask them to give us a little more and briefly introduce themselves. So I'll begin with Deland.
Hi, Quinta, thank you. As you mentioned, Deland Jaff, policy analyst on the sustainability advocacy team. I help cover state issues for the sustainability team relating to low carbon fuels, electric vehicles, and decarbonizing transportation.
Thank you. Dr. Martin?
Yes, hi, my name is Jeremy Martin from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I work on transportation fuel policies in states across the country and at the federal level, which I've been doing for the last 15 years.
Rich Cassell.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rich Cassell. I'm in New York. I'm checking in from New York to keep up with the theme of the chats. Good to see everybody. I'm a partner in a firm called AJW. We work on clean energy and clean transportation issues in New York at the federal level and in California, and sometimes all the other states in between. I spent most of my career at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I directed NRDC's clean fuels and vehicles policy work for many years. I also chair EPA's Mobile Source Technical Review Subcommittee, which is a really wordy group that is the external advisory committee to EPA on fuels and vehicles issues. I'm really glad to be here today.
Thank you, Rich, Jeremy, and Deland. We are very pleased to have such an esteemed panel. And I want to remind the audience that we held a webinar in November last year that talked about low carbon fuels and what they are. Obviously, we can't rehash the entire webinar, but we have a very short video that provides an explanation so that we can all at least start off on the same footing. So here's the video now.
Greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon dioxide or CO2, threaten our future and cost us billions of dollars each year. Lowering emissions can help reduce the extreme weather, wildfires, and droughts that threaten our safety. The good news is we as consumers have the power to make more sustainable choices. One thing we can do is drive cars that produce less carbon dioxide. Electric vehicles, or EVs, are one popular solution. But they're not the only solution. Low-carbon fuels, or LCFs, emit fewer carbon dioxide emissions than traditional gasoline or diesel fuel, and many low-carbon fuels can be used directly in their place. Just like electricity is already powering EVs, other low-carbon fuels are available today, like renewable diesel, ethanol, and hydrogen. And there's even sustainable aviation fuel, which is already in use for some flights. In fact, low-carbon fuels can not only reduce emissions from passenger vehicles and planes, they can also power the ships, trains, and delivery trucks that support our daily lives. There are even more types of low-carbon fuel in development, and their use will continue to grow as technology advances. It's vital that we all work together towards a more sustainable future, and low carbon fuels can help us get there. To find out how low carbon fuels can power your sustainability journey, visit consumerreports.org/LCF.
Right. So let me explain briefly what the format of today's webinar will be. I have some questions for the panelists, again, just to establish some basics around low carbon fuels and low carbon fuel standards. Please feel free to, again, drop your questions into the Q&A or into the chat. We will be monitoring those, and I will be asking questions that are asked by the audience as well. So you can actually go ahead and start doing that. So Dylan, now that we're all on the same page on what a low carbon fuel is, can you help us understand why it's important to reduce emissions from the transportation sector?
Yeah, so obviously greenhouse gases emissions are very detrimental to the environment, and these impacts of climate change cost consumers billions of dollars every year. Specifically in the transportation sector, as you saw in the video, transportation emissions account for the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States at about 27% of the country's total emissions, and the largest contributor by market sector. So if we're going to take on this task of reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall, it really makes sense to start from the highest emitting sector. And there's already been a lot of progress underway to getting these numbers down, and we'll talk about that a little bit more today.
Thank you, Dylan. Jeremy, I know you have a couple slides that you want to share with us. Can you help us understand what a low carbon fuel standard is and why these policies are important?
Sure. So a low carbon fuel standard is a requirement that people selling transportation fuel gradually reduce the pollution from those fuels. There's a whole bunch of different transportation fuels. Of course, people are familiar with gasoline and diesel. Already today, we have blended into gasoline and diesel. You'd see ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel. There's some vehicles that run on natural gas and could run on renewable natural gas or biomethane. And of course, electric vehicles are a huge part of the future. So the way a low carbon fuel standard works is we assess the pollution from all of the transportation fuels in use and recognize that when we think about the pollution from transportation fuel, we need to think about it on a life cycle basis. And so we don't only think about tailpipe pollution, but we think about all the pollution associated with producing and using those fuels. And so, of course, for an electric vehicle, there's no tailpipe pollution, but of course there can be pollution associated with generating the electricity. And likewise, different kinds of biofuels, depending on how they're produced. And even for gasoline, the largest part of the pollution comes from the tailpipe, but there are also pollution coming from oil refining and oil extraction. So all of those things are added up. And then basically, there's a requirement that the weighted average of all of those transportation station fuel goes steadily down over time. So I guess this is a chart from California, which has had a low carbon fuel standard in place for the last decade or a little more, about the different fuels in use in California and what their life cycle global warming pollution is on a kind of per equivalent basis.
Okay, so your next slide has some funny words on it: credits and deficits. Can you help us understand how those tie into low carbon fuel standards?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the complexities here is we have these different kinds of fuels and they're used differently, right? And so the ethanol and biodiesel, renewable diesel, these are typically blended into gasoline and diesel and then sold at gas stations. So, part of the way that you comply with this policy, and so if I'm an oil refiner and I'm selling gasoline and diesel, then in order to comply with this policy, I have to look at what I'm blending into it. So what kind of ethanol, what kind of biodiesel, what kind of renewable diesel am I using? One of the important things about these policies is that they recognize that depending on how you produce all these different fuels, it makes a difference, right? So we know that average electricity has a certain pollution, but renewable electricity is less. Likewise, different kinds of ethanol production processes would be more or less polluting. So for this reason, all the fuels that are higher than the standard are generating deficits. That's mostly the gasoline and diesel. And then all the fuels that are cleaner than the standard are generating credits, but the amount of credit depends on how much cleaner they are than the standard. And so, the refiner selling gasoline and diesel can blend gasoline, ethanol and biodiesel in, but of course they can't blend electricity into the gasoline and diesel that they sell. And so that's where this credit system comes into play. The electricity used for charging electric vehicles will be generating credits. Those credits will be then assigned to a party like the fleet operator if it's a fleet of commercial vehicles, or to the utility for residential vehicles. And then they'll use those credits to support transportation electrification. And then they sell those credits to the refiner, and who can use them to offset their deficits. So anyway, it's a system that connects all the disparate parts of the transportation fuel system together, and allows allows us to make sure that that the policies are benefiting electrification as well as fuels that can be blended directly into gasoline and diesel.
Great, thank you for that explanation. So Rich, let me turn to you. Why is a low carbon fuel standard, or LCFS, why is that beneficial?
So there are a number of different ways to look at the benefits of a low carbon fuel standard, or as it's being called in New York, where I live, a clean fuel standard. Different states are using different phrases, usually CFS or LCFS would be the acronyms. Let me start by talking about the environmental benefits. Really what's going on here is a state that has a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard has set up a market mechanism to basically incentivize a shift among consumers and fleets towards the lower carbon choices, whether those are the fuels on this chart or electrifying, rather than using the standard default of gasoline or diesel. That provides two main benefits. In the near term, it reduces not only the carbon emissions from our tailpipes, but also has the added benefit of reducing diesel particulate matter that triggers asthma attacks, bronchitis, cancer, heart disease, and thousands of premature deaths every year. And it also creates a revenue source that will accelerate electrification in the long run. So in the near term, you get emission reductions. In the long term, you get the whole shift towards a zero carbon transportation system that we are striving towards. And this chart shows a bit how that would happen. All those credits and deficits are being traded in a way that, in its most, if I were to oversimplify to the greatest extent possible, I'd say what this all means is that Exxon is going to end up funding electrification in communities all around the country, because they and every other oil company are generating tons of deficits, which they then have to figure out how to offset by buying credits. Who are they buying credits from? They're buying credits from all the different entities that are involved on the low carbon side of the equation. So what does that mean? Let me put a couple numbers on. So Jeremy mentioned that California was the first state. We've got 11 years of data now from that state and their low carbon fuel standard. We now can see that a little over 3 billion gallons of petroleum are being displaced every year. That's 3 billion gallons of petroleum that are not being burned and are not leading to emissions in our air. We can also see, and California put out a great study on this not quite a year ago, May last year, that the benefits of the program are increasingly disproportionately being felt in the communities that have always traditionally breathed the most diesel exhaust. Communities near rail yards, ports, highways, low-income communities, communities of color that have faced a chronic, long-standing environmental justice issue of breathing disproportionate levels of diesel exhaust. One of the big questions around the program has always been, well, do we get the benefits there as well? It ends up that California, the data shows that, in fact, the reduction in diesel particulate matter in what they call high-risk communities is 3 times as great as it is in what they call low-risk communities. Plain and simple, if you have communities that have many, many dirty diesel trucks in their midst and you clean them up, well, the benefits are going to be in those communities as well. So you've got petroleum displacement, you've got reduction in toxic diesel particulate matter, and you've got the reduction in the carbon emissions as well, which Jeremy has already gone through. I'm part of a coalition effort in New York. It's called Clean Fuels New York. And we commissioned a study last year to look at what would happen if you took this California program, just plopped it down in New York. And the results were really impressive. We're looking at roughly $1 billion in cumulative health benefits by 2030. We're looking at fuel cost savings somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 billion. Really significant benefits. So there would be versions of this in every state that had a program like this. I think that most important, I know I put a lot of information out there. If I were to sum it up, I'd go back to where I started, which is the most important benefits of a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard is that it creates a revenue stream that will decarbonize buses and trucks today with renewable diesel, biodiesel, and other biofuels. Mm-hmm. And it lays the groundwork to accelerate electrification by creating that revenue stream that can go into charging infrastructure and other critical investments.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I think that leads me to my next question. I'll direct this at Dylan, but others feel free to join in. Why can't we just electrify everything? Why are we even bothering with low carbon fuels?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we get asked a lot, especially from a consumer perspective. A lot of the vehicles that consumers will be using will continue to move forward as electric vehicles. But one of the things that we've seen is many states are even requiring regulations that, such as advanced clean cars, that will mandate that all new vehicles sold after a certain date, and for this one in particular, 2035, be zero emission or plug-in hybrids. But one of the things that we also need to consider is some of the harder to electrify sectors, such as the medium and heavy duty freight sectors, and a lot of the vehicles that really help us go about our daily lives, such as buses, UPS trucks, delivery trucks, all these kind of different heavy duty vehicles. While there's still high ambition that we'll be able to get these fleets to zero emission eventually, one of the things that we need to ensure is that there's still a path forward to reduce emissions from the vehicles that are still going to be on the road by 2035, and even beyond that. Considering these regulations, there will still be millions of traditional fuel vehicles on the road beyond 2035, still maintaining their useful life. So I think we need to consider really an all of the above approach to make sure that we're helping reduce emissions in the near term, to make sure that that helps us in getting to our goal in meeting our climate goals in the longer term.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that? Any other panelists?
I think one of the important things to recognize here is that this is part of a shift across the entire transportation and energy sector that needs to happen if we're going to hit our longer term goals of a net zero economy. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's not just what the consumer choice of, do I buy an electric vehicle or not? It's how do I charge that vehicle? Where's the power coming from? How is the grid being updated to connect the new renewable energy to my community where I'm going to be charging my vehicle. There's so many different moving parts that, as much as it would be great if we could somehow just snap our fingers and we suddenly have 200 million electric vehicles, the reality is that the system is much more complicated than that. And so all the different pieces need to move forward. But I often think about these issues from the perspective of the asthmatic kid down the block from me right now. That 5-year-old asthmatic kid shouldn't have to wait to 2040 when all of New York's transit buses are electric, or 2035 when the school buses are electric. There are ways to reduce the risk now for that child. And the clean fuel standard, or the low carbon fuel standard, is a important way. It's part of how we address that child's needs now.
So as we're talking about consumers, let's bring it home. What is the benefit to consumers of a low carbon fuel standard? And I'll direct this to Deland, just because you're with Consumer Reports.
Yeah, so some of the ways that consumers will benefit from a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard is by seeing just increased fueling options for the vehicles that are on the road today. But they'll also see more innovation and scaling of existing clean transportation technology, making it more accessible for the everyday consumer. If we take electric vehicles again, just another example, many of the laws that are currently in place, and I think we've referenced California as one of those. There's also Washington and Oregon here on the West Coast that have adopted these clean fuels policies. Many of these laws today require that a certain amount of these credits that are gained from the fuel providers are to be invested directly to support the build out of our public zero emission vehicle infrastructure network. One of our surveys here at Consumer Reports has shown that one of the largest barriers for consumers to transition to electric vehicles is hesitation around, the access to infrastructure. So these policies are going to go a long way to bring better cost-saving technology to consumers and really easing some of the concerns that arise from considering transitioning away from traditional fuels.
Thank you. And so now I have a question about how we make sure that there's equity in a low carbon fuel standard. I'll start with Jeremy because we haven't heard from you in a while. How can low carbon fuel standards address equity and EJ concerns?
Yeah, well, one of the ways a number of the existing policies in California and Oregon and Washington have taken is that, we've mentioned that these policies generate support for transportation electrification. Often that would go through, utilities or transit agencies. And so the rules have been set up to give them instructions to make sure that, a substantial portion of the investments they make to support transportation electrification go in overburdened communities, places where you have, higher pollution, and places where you may have, people who aren't able to afford a new electric vehicle. And so I think that's one of the really critical policy designs to make sure that this policy is not just advancing transportation electrification kind of in general, but that we're really targeting the benefits to address the harms caused by transportation pollution today. So that's one of the really key.
Thank you. A general question for all of you, because we've heard mention of California, Oregon, Washington. So these states have low carbon fuel standards. What role does the federal government play here? And why are we not hearing about a federal standard? Anyone?
I'll say, right now, I think it's interesting because, we have in these states, we have a low carbon fuel standard. In the federal government, we have something called the renewable fuel standard, which basically supports mostly ethanol and biodiesel. And so, I think there's some overlap in theory between these policies, but in practice, the low carbon fuel standard, recognizes the increasingly important role of electric vehicles in cleaning up transportation pollution, and also recognizes that, it's not enough to just, use more biofuel, that we need to really make sure that all the fuel producers are minimizing pollution from all the fuels that we're using. And so, so there's an overlap between these policies, and the state and federal policies interact. But just maybe I'll turn it over to Rich after teeing this up. But there was a hearing in the Senate just a couple of weeks ago. So I think that this idea that this policy model makes sense and could make sense for a future federal policy is just, that conversation has just gotten started.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Sure, I'll add a couple thoughts. So the renewable fuel standard was put into place in the mid 2000s, really as a not as a climate policy, but as a policy that was looking at energy independence, that was looking at fuels that could be produced in the United States. And so it was really focused around how do we increase the volume of the renewable fuels that we use, principally ethanol and biodiesel, renewable diesel. Today we have a different priority, and the priority is decarbonization. And so the federal solution in the long run is to move towards a system that decarbonizes the entire transportation system. And as Jeremy said, that also serves to accelerate electrification and hydrogen and moving towards all the different lowest carbon, zero carbon, and even one day perhaps carbon negative fuels and technologies that will come into, and to do that in a way that that uses the market to unleash innovation that's already going on out there. So I think it's the federal government will play an important role in this. It does play an important role. I mean, traditionally, EPA sets vehicle emission standards, and they are considering new CO2 greenhouse emission standards for all vehicles. It sets fuel standards through the renewable fuel standard, but also other fuel parameters. So we use regulation, we use incentives, we use tax credits. They're all tools in the toolkit. The low carbon fuel standard becomes another one. And I think we've seen from California and Oregon, the two states that have had the program for a number of years, that if you want to go to a state where electrification is happening more than anywhere else, where the use of low carbon sustainable liquid fuels is happening more than anywhere else, you go to the states that have this incentive because it works.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think now we will.
Oh, can I add one other thing, if you don't mind on that? Which Jeremy teed me up for, and I didn't mention. So there was a hearing last month in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and that hearing looked at, for the first time in this Congress, the idea of a low carbon or clean fuel standard or policy at the federal level. Around that hearing are a number of different stakeholder groups representing all the different fuels and technologies, environmental groups, other stakeholders that have all come together in something called the Drive Clean Coalition, which is working towards a robust clean fuels, low carbon fuels policy to be added into the mix. And if you want information about that, it's at driveclean.us. So Drive Clean is one word, driveclean.us, and folks can learn a little bit more about that effort.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah.
And if I could add one more thing to that, I think one of the keys here too is that this federal policy is and should be, as it's being planned, it should be complementary to some of the policies that are already being done in these states, right? And should allow some of these states like California to continue, setting strong standards that reduce the carbon intensity, even if they are kind of more aggressive than what the federal government would do. California, Washington, Oregon, 3 states that have already enacted these policies. They are, for lack of better terms, have a head start in reaching these carbon intensity reductions. So making sure that these policies are still allowed to take place in certain states and still allowed to have strong standards as we move forward throughout these years.
Yeah, excellent point. So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and we have enough time, I think, to address a few of them, or as many as we can in the time remaining. Here's one. Greetings from Lima, Peru. So this one came in earlier when people were registering last week. Almost all of the taxis here use natural gas, which burns much cleaner than gasoline and is much less expensive. This has been the situation for years in Lima. What is the problem in the US not using this excellent alternative to gasoline? This seems like a Jeremy question.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's well, so first of all, natural gas, compressed natural gas vehicles, there is some use of compressed natural gas for vehicles in the US, mostly for buses. I think in a lot of those applications right now, there's some migration towards battery electric instead, or potentially hydrogen fuel cells. So in the context of course, natural gas is another fossil fuel, and so in the clean fuel standards, the states that have those, what we've seen is that this policy isn't a vehicle policy, it's a fuel policy, but it encourages fleets that are using compressed natural gas to switch to renewable natural gas because it has a lower less pollution associated with its production, and it isn't drawing fossil fuel from underground, but it also provides support for electrification. I think one of the really important things about this policy is I think a lot of people have questions like, oh, I've heard something good about this fuel, I've heard something bad about that fuel, what about that? And this policy design says, we're not going to take a position on, we're not going to name specific fuels and say this is a policy to support, ethanol or biodiesel or a particular or electricity. This vet says we need to reduce pollution from transportation, and we need to do a scientific assessment of all the fuels. So that would include natural gas for natural gas vehicles. It would include, electricity for electric vehicles, and different kinds of biofuels could be blended into gasoline and diesel. And then that assessment of the kind of scientific assessment of that pollution can be updated over time as our understanding emerges. And so I think it's important to understand this. This is a policy about fuels, and we have other policies about vehicles, but having a policy that says reduce pollution from fuels works together really nicely with a policy that says reduce pollution from vehicles, or let's get more electric vehicles or whatever. So I think I won't speak to why we don't see light duty gas vehicles in the US. People have tried to sell them a little bit, and they didn't really catch on. But the point of the fuel standard is to make sure that whatever fuel you're using, you use the least polluting available source of that fuel.
Yeah, love that. It's a good low carbon fuel standard is technology agnostic, fuel agnostic. Very well put. So here's another question. How are you going to deal with jet airplanes that consume enormous amounts of carbon-based fuel? There are millions of flights each year just in the US alone.
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at that. So aviation is a growing source of greenhouse emissions, and there are added climate impacts, not just from the emissions from burning the fuel, but from the contrails, the white cloud-like streams that we see behind the airplanes at altitude. It's a serious issue because, of course, we haven't yet figured out a way to get an electric jet engine that can even come close to working for our aviation needs. The solution that's getting a lot of attention now is something called sustainable aviation fuel. It's a close cousin to renewable diesel. It's produced by some of the same companies, and it is a what we call a drop-in fuel. You can use, you don't have to modify the engine at all to use the sustainable aviation fuel. And so what we're starting to see is that airlines that have net zero and other greenhouse gas commitments are looking for ways to use this sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF as they call it. But if you look at where they're using it in airports where they get low carbon fuel standard or clean fuel standard credit. So the flight from San Francisco to JFK on JetBlue may use SAF because of the low carbon fuel standard in that state. But when it goes from JFK back to San Francisco, it uses petroleum because the incentive doesn't exist there. So that's another reason why it's important for states that are interested in bringing in lower emitting fuels into their state. They put these policies in place because the finite supply of the low carbon fuel is chasing the incentive. It's being used where that incentive exists, and it's not being used where it doesn't.
Yeah, and if I could just echo one of the points, that you're making, Rich, like one of the things that these policies do is that they drive and they really force innovation on these companies and on these technologies, and really make sure that these companies are innovating their technologies to make sure that they're meeting these requirements and meeting these regulations. So, it might be something that they're already planning, but just by being in a state that requires this carbon intensity reduction, you are getting these companies to, you're incentivizing them to come up with this new technology, to really bring this new technology to a scale that's ready to hit the market and ready to be on a wide scale basis.
Thank you. Here's another question from the audience. So what can we drivers do today to reduce pollution? Buy 15% ethanol fuel if available locally? If not, what else?
Yeah, I think that's a great solution for in the near term. I think for any driver that's using a vehicle after the year 2001, I believe is the date that they are certified to use E15, ethanol 15. Obviously for some of these other fuels, such as ethanol 85, you would need a whole new vehicle. The same goes with electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles, but that's one way, and using different fuel types. Another option that really hasn't been discussed as much here is finding alternative transportation modes, and really, making the most use of public transportation, making the most use of active transportation. And those are just some things that come to mind that, how consumers themselves could help contribute.
Thank you. So I see several questions here talking about hybrid versus EVs. Here's the one that I think captures the spirit of most of them. Why have policies pushed for pure electrification instead of promoting hybridization? Considering the life cycle of vehicles and the limited number of current battery production capacity, wouldn't more hybrid vehicles have a greater benefit than just some electric vehicles, considering the statistics of the average driving trip? I'm sure that's something you guys have never heard.
I guess, yeah, I can offer a thought there. I think there's policy support for both. It's a little different in different states, and so that gets a little complicated. But I do think a lot of the trends that we're observing are kind of driven by the market. That's what consumers are interested in. So I think there are advantages to both, but as the range of battery electric vehicles has increased, some of the advantages of hybrids have been less. But some of this is also, I'll say, experts forecasting this 5 or 10 years ago had one set of expectations, and things don't always work out exactly the way we expect. Consumer preferences may be different, technology may emerge differently, and that's to bring it back to this sort of policy framework. That's why it's useful to have a policy design which it doesn't fall apart if you thought plug-in hybrids would be the way that things went, and instead battery electric vehicles are more popular. I think it's great to have policies which say these are both vehicles which may work in different contexts, and we need to focus on the goal of reducing pollution and not, tie up the policy too much. And like, if our prediction about which vehicle type or which fuel type is going to be most popular, or turns out to be inaccurate, we still want the policy to be driving emission reductions.
Yeah, well,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that was well said. Please carry on.
Yeah, I think that the key here is that we're a big, complicated country where the driving patterns, the driving needs are so different from place to place, from family to family. And the approach that has traditionally worked has been an approach that provides a fuel neutral, technology neutral, performance-based approach to setting standards, to setting incentives, and so on. Our real successes in reducing emissions from vehicles, and despite not being done with the job, the emissions from today's vehicles are, across the board, from a health perspective, way beyond 90% cleaner than they were when I was a kid. And cars are, we have greater efficiency. We plow a lot of that into bigger vehicles, and stronger air conditioning systems. That's probably a different webinar. But we have had great success setting fuel neutral, technology neutral performance standards, and the clean fuel standard or the low carbon fuel standard follows in that path by saying we're not going to predict what fuel or technology is the winner for you and your family or your business. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a system that incentivizes and makes it easier for you to make the low carbon choice if you choose to do so. It doesn't ban a diesel truck. It doesn't require or mandate a particular type of car, but it changes the market signals. And after all, we all drive gasoline. Those of us who drive gasoline cars do so because the market until recently sent a very strong signal that was the fuel and engine combination of choice.
Yeah, thank you. I think that addresses a question I was going to ask from the audience. Does this mean I won't be able to buy gasoline anymore? And I think we are clear that that's not what the standards are here for, not to ban anything. Okay, this one is a little, this question I thought was really interesting. Even though it didn't directly ask about low carbon fuels, I want to ask it. Will CR have reports on how much corporations contribute to environmental damage? When the pandemic first hit and shut down our entire economy, almost all of us consumers stopped driving, but that only resulted in a tiny dip in emissions. We realized we weren't the problem. So that's I think a really good question, and maybe an opportunity here to talk about how shipping and other things depend on fuel as well. Does anyone want to tackle this?
Yeah, I could help out, especially with the first portion. At Consumer Reports, we're actively looking for different opportunities to really, partner with corporations, partner with companies to help them to reduce their emissions and really see, what are different ways they could go to reduce these emissions. From a low carbon fuel standard perspective, what we are seeing is that these fuels, I think I've mentioned earlier that these policies and these fuel policies are really going to have a big impact on the medium and heavy duty sector, which, a lot of that doesn't come directly from consumers. A lot of that does come from some of the companies that are operating these fleets. So there is a strong connection between the low carbon fuel standards and reducing emissions from, these fleets, these companies' transportation and fleet policies.
Thank you. Here's another one that's, talking about just the impacts on people and the environment. Please touch upon biofuels from palm oil, which are exponentially increasing while decimating rainforests in Indonesia and Malaysia. Human rights abuses are heavy. Anyone care to comment?
I'll jump in on that. I think that the use of palm oil in biofuels is a failure of policy. I think that it's exactly the reason why if we want to move biofuels sector towards more and more sustainable, lower and lower carbon fuels, we need effective policies that move the market that way. The use of palm is an absolute example of virgin palm, is an absolute example of the failure of policy to address that issue. If you look at what the leaders in the industry, companies like Neste and others are doing, they're moving away from palm. It's not from virgin palm. They have, you know, they understand that their long-term business relies on a fuel that's as low carbon and sustainable across the board, however you define sustainability, and that includes the human rights side and all labor side, all the rest. That's the future, which is why they support strong, aggressive, low carbon fuel standards, clean fuel standards, I think that in the future, we'll see the market continue to move in that direction as policies demand better and better performance.
And maybe just to clarify something I think Rich was alluding to, but wasn't maybe totally clear on the chart I showed. So the chart I showed biodiesel and renewable diesel, and then there was a carbon intensity assigned to that. But actually, the way the policy works is, if you sell biodiesel or renewable diesel in California, you need to say, like, what is it made of? Is it made of palm oil? Is it made of soybean oil? Is it made of used cooking oil? Is it made of tallow or some other kind of source of fat? And each of those gets a different score. And so the idea that there is land use change, deforestation associated with using palm oil shows up directly in this score, and so you get that sort of differentiation. So I think it's it's an important point, which is that it's not just like biofuels or biofuels. Depends what they're made of and how much energy is used. I think there were some questions come up about producing ethanol. How much energy does it go into that production process? So this policy actually, by focusing on the life cycle, looks at where did the materials come from? What was the deforestation? What was the energy used for conversion? All of those things go into making sure that that the fuels are clean, and to make sure that the ones that are cleaner have a preference over the ones that are more polluting.
Great, thank you. I have a couple more questions. We are running up on time, but lots of questions. How do we increase the affordability of low emissions vehicles? And I know you guys have kind of tackled this already, but a clear question, and we put this person, can we satisfy their curiosity?
These policies, clean fuel standards, can do that directly by, California's using some of the revenue from charging electric vehicles to fund a cash on the hood rebate for electric vehicles. And has been mentioned before, for medium and heavy duty vehicles, the fuel is an even bigger part of the kind of overall operating cost of the vehicle. So these policies make a really big difference in the affordability, especially when you look at it over the kind of total cost of ownership for a medium and heavy duty, by recognizing those emission benefits.
Thank you. We've had several people ask about hydrogen. Some are supporting it. Some are saying it has safety issues. I know we've addressed this, but could we again say one more time that low carbon fuels are fuel agnostic and technology agnostic?
Yeah, that's right. So, and I think also for hydrogen, it's important. So I showed an illustrative list of some of the main fuels that are used for compliance in California today. Hydrogen is used, not at a huge level, so I didn't put it on the chart. But that's the thing about this policy, is it doesn't say like, oh, well, we weren't thinking about hydrogen when we drafted the policy, so it's not covered, which is, kind of the situation we're in a way with the federal policy, right? This policy says, if you have a completely new fuel, what we need is a life cycle analysis. And I think it's also important with some of these questions about, is it safe to store? What are the advantages from a vehicle perspective? Those are questions to a certain extent, for that may not be under the fuel policy, or at least the kind of the low carbon fuel standard policy. Like, obviously we need any transportation of anything in pipelines or in trucks to be done safely. We need, and so, there's a lot of different, kind of regulations in the sector that all need to work together to make sure the vehicles are safe, which will be the responsibility of vehicle manufacturers to make sure that, so.
Thank you.
Oh,
So-
maybe, I'm sorry, one last thing, which is, of course, you can make hydrogen from different things. So hydrogen today is typically made from natural gas. It's actually a fairly polluting fuel. Of course, you can make hydrogen from electricity. You can make it from renewable electricity. So this is exactly just like with electricity and other things, why this sort of life cycle basis is important. So it's not just, well, hydrogen has certain attributes once you've got it, but how you made it has a really big impact on the pollution. And so that's why we think a life cycle approach is important for fuels like hydrogen, as well as for other fuels.
Thank you. So I'm going to give all the panelists 1 minute to wrap up your thoughts. Just summarize quickly, and then we can wrap up the podcast. Sorry, not the podcast, the webinar. I'm not sure to begin with, but I'll leave it open. Again, take about a minute to just summarize your thoughts.
Who first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind going first. I'll say, this has been a really great conversation, and I think, a great job. I think everyone did a great job building off of, the conversation that we had in our last webinar about the fuel technology. And really, this is really the next step to really help people get up to speed on what kind of policies they could be working on and supporting to really make that next jump in decarbonizing our transportation sector. One of the things few things I want to emphasize is it's really going to be an all of the above approach, and making sure that, we're looking at all the tools in the toolkit to achieve these climate emission goals. And, one of the things that I just want to clarify is, I saw a lot of conversation, like you mentioned, Quinta, about hydrogen in the chat. One of the things when we say zero emission also encompasses battery electric and hydrogen for a lot of these policies too. So, it really is about making sure that there are clean fuel options for consumers and for companies, and that we're making sure that this transition is really helpful in getting us to where we need to be.
Thank you. Nice summary. Rich?
Sure. So Mark Twain, one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes goes something like, people are really bad at predictions, especially about the future. Where we've been successful in the last 50 years of clean air and emission regulation has been where we didn't try to predict the future. We didn't pick a single fuel, we didn't pick a single technology, but instead we set performance standards or incentives based on performance standards that were fuel neutral and technology neutral. When we've done that, vehicles have gotten cleaner, they've gotten more efficient, communities have gotten cleaner air, children have had fewer asthma and other health impacts, and so on. So as we look at the clean fuel standard, low carbon fuel standard discussion, it comes down to, first and foremost, we have to get started. The 5-year-old asthmatic can't wait, and neither can the climate. We need to get started. We need to stay with a performance-based approach that encourages and rewards innovation, and doesn't pick single winners and losers before we know what the answers are. We need to follow an approach that dedicates resources and revenues to correcting decades of disproportionate health burdens felt in environmental justice communities because of the preponderance of diesel depots, rail yards, ports, and so on in their midst. And so our policies should have levers in them that dedicate resources in those directions and to those communities. I think that's really important. If we do all that, we'll end up in the near term with decarbonized, cleaner vehicles that are using an increasing amount of sustainable liquid fuels or gaseous fuels, RNG instead of CNG, for example. And we'll end up with billions of dollars being invested in the long-term electrification and zero carbon future. In the long term, we'll have electric vehicles where we can, and we'll continue to use those sustainable liquid fuels in the market niches where electrification is unlikely. So we can do all that, and but we do have to get started. So I really appreciate being able to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. Those are all good points, and I appreciate being able to join the conversation. I'll say, maybe bring us back to the first question, which is, why do this clean fuels instead of having electric vehicles? And the answer is that we absolutely need to do both. From my perspective, we need the policies for automakers and truck manufacturers, really encouraging them to reduce pollution and to transition to electric vehicles. We need utilities to be working on this space to make sure the electricity they're generating is as clean as possible, and that they're investing in the distribution infrastructure so that we can charge electric vehicles everywhere. And then this is an obligation on fuel producers, and really to make sure that all the different sectors that play into the transportation world have similar responsibilities to move in the same direction and to reduce pollution. So, having coverage and alignment across all the different sectors is really, it's not about choosing one strategy over another. It's about, moving forward on all of these, in all of these areas, and to make sure that all the important industries that are part of the system are getting cleaner.
Excellent summaries. Thank you. Delan, how can the audience get involved in helping to make these policies and standards a reality?
Yeah, so there's a few different things that can be done. First of all, like we mentioned, California, Washington, Oregon, just know again, you already have a clean fuel standard policy, and that will guide the transition to cleaner fuels. As time progresses, there will still be more opportunities in these states to urge your representatives and government officials to continue to move the needle and set more aggressive carbon intensity reduction goals of transportation fuels. If you don't live in those 3 states, you still can urge your legislatures and government officials to consider introducing these policies so that you can benefit from these rules. Currently, there's a few different states that have processes underway to establish clean fuel standard. Just to name a few, New York, New Mexico, Michigan, Vermont are a few states that have introduced policies this year to establish clean fuel standards in their states, among a few others. So if you do live in these states that are engaging in these policies, you can voice your support for these bills and help them get across the finish line. Specifically, Consumer Reports has been engaging pretty closely with New York and New Mexico legislation on these items. And if you on this slide here, we do have a few petitions that we put together for consumer advocates to sign up and urge their representatives to support these bills. And then finally, a few times on this webinar has been discussed a federal clean fuel standard and how this can be complementary to what's already going on in these states. While this isn't something that has been introduced just yet, it's something that here at Consumer Reports will continue monitoring. I know UCS and AJW will be doing the same. But if you want to continue following our sustainability channel and the things that we have going on here, we'll be sure to keep you up to date on what's happening, what kind of actions going on at the federal level.
Thank you, Delan. So we've come to the end of the webinar, and thank you for sticking with us through it all. As we wrap up, I just want to leave you with these resources. Consumer Reports has developed a hub of information at cr.org/LCF, which is dedicated to low carbon fuels. The animated video I showed at the beginning is on there, as well as numerous fact sheets, reports, and other resources on low carbon fuels and policies. We also have a hub dedicated to EVs and hybrids, and you can find it at that link. The Department of Energy also has an alternative fuels data center where you can find more information about these low carbon fuels and the vehicles that run on them. And then finally, and most important, if you're interested in testifying on government policies and regulations, on reducing transportation emissions, we will be sending out a survey after the webinar. So please indicate your interests so that we can keep you informed. So that's it for us. Many thanks to the esteemed panelists for participating, our colleagues behind the scenes, and thank you, audience, for attending the webinar, for your thoughtful questions. Please do check our LTF Hub frequently for updates. Thank you for your time and attention, and see you next time.